Welcome, everyone, to panel two. Um, the title of this panel is The Ages and Aging of Photographs. And our first paper is by Elena Vivich. Elena is a postgraduate student at Higher School of Economics University in the School of Philosophy and Cultural Studies. Working in the area of media and technology studies, she has a master's degree in visual culture and has worked on problems of digital images and screen culture. Her paper today is titled Aging of Digital Photography, Accessing Time by Code Conversion. And please join me in welcoming Elena Vivich.
Hello everyone, I'm glad to be here. Sorry I will speak in Russian because the text is not so easy and I was just not sure that I can put it clear in English, but I'm sure that translators can manage it. Also, I have no translation to the presentation, but it is not so much connected with the speech and it is not so important, so I will share my screen now. Yeah, I changed my the name of my presentation, but and в общем в программке, наверное, предыдущее название.
Нет, в программке нынешняя,
да?
Лен.
Ну,
да, все
хорошо.
в порядке. Угу.
Вот. Мой доклад посвящен проблеме медиума. Это одна из основных проблем в исследовании фотографии. Но в данном случае одна из моих задач будет обратить внимание на техническую литературу как какой-то ресурс для аргументации, который может быть интересен для исследования фотографии. По своей специализации занимаюсь не конкретно фотографией, а цифровыми медиумами. Поэтому здесь я буду концентрироваться не на историческом развитии фотографии и ее миграции одного носителя на другой, а на состоянии в настоящий момент, когда чаще всего медиумом является цифровое устройство. То есть мне интересны условия, при которых оцифрованная или созданная при помощи цифровых устройств фотография может возникать на экране или редактироваться. Прежде чем перейти к делу, я проясню значение ключевых терминов, которые будут использоваться далее. Так, в фокусе внимания устройства имеющее ЦПУ – это центральный процессор управления, и экран, к которому относятся современные смартфоны, ноутбуки, стационарные компьютеры и ряд других устройств. Их я имею в виду, говоря техническое устройство или электронные медиумы. Под цифровым изображением понимается любое изображение, сгенерированное при помощи логико-математических устройств измерительного класса, включая иконки и элементы интерфейса. Сюда же относится цифровая фотография.
Елена, простите, пожалуйста,
да?
можно чуть-чуть помедленнее, просто чтобы переводчики успевали?
Да, конечно. Это изображение, оно может быть воспроизведено и в виде голограммы, и в условиях дополненной реальности, поэтому нет смысла концентрироваться на экранах, как значащих поверхностях, как предлагает, например, Хухтама. Для обозначения материальных условий возникновения изображения будет использовано понятие субстрат. Это не поверхность, как традиционно считается в эстетике, а электронная начинка медиума. Также будет использоваться понятие изоморфизм в том смысле, в котором оно обычно используется в математике. Изоморфны друг другу множества, обладающие одинаковой структурой. Отображения или функции разного характера создают изоморфные множества, если после выполнения процедуры структура изначального множества сохраняется. Использование этого понятия оправдано поскольку теория множеств лежит в основе устройства любого цифрового медиума, и без нее идея конечного автомата такого типа невозможна. Понятие изоморфизма достаточно универсально, часто используется в контексте исследования искусственного интеллекта и в нейронауках, и также в теориях визуального восприятия. Существует ряд более или менее разработанных подходов к анализу цифровой фотографии, которые мне известны. Я не буду разбирать все, упомяну только, на мой взгляд, общие тренды и значимых конкретно для моего исследования авторов. На слайде также упомянуты авторы просто для ориентации, о какой оптике идет речь. Но не все они писали именно про фотографию, хотя, вероятно, являются часто референтными источниками. Возможно, самый популярный подход – это социально-антропологический, когда фотография рассматривается в контексте более широких социальных систем, как отражение трендов, регулирующий элемент отношений и так далее. Сюда можно отнести исторические исследования, исследования практик. Он часто пересекается с герменевтическим подходом, когда анализируется содержание изображения, его значение. Существует феноменология и постфеноменология фотографии, которая пересекается с теорией образа, и, как правило, здесь можно говорить о материальности только как о являющейся субъекту, о материальности как поверхности, текстуре или интерфейсе, в стиле Гибсона или Бруно. Это интересный взгляд, но я в данном случае буду говорить несколько о другом. Есть еще лаканианская перспектива, достаточно разработанная, с которой подходит к цифровым явлениям вообще. Отдельно я выделила медиа-исследования, поскольку к ним относится цифровая археология и акторная сетевая теория. Это не подходы, разработанные специально для фотографии, но в данном случае будут заимствованы некоторые принципы и идеи. Из археологии медиа будет заимствовано следующее. Во-первых, это рассмотрение объекта не как среза или застывшей вне времени формы, а в развитии. Все состояния объекта в разные моменты времени являются частью его жизненного цикла и участвуют в его определении. Во-вторых, нам симпатично использование ссылок на технические источники теоретиков Берлинской школы и их апелляции к устройству технических средств, которыми они занимаются. И в-третьих, археология медиа обычно подразумевает построение общей семантики для всех источников, которые описывают объект. С другой стороны, будет заимствован один принцип из акторно-сетевой теории, поскольку цифровая электроника рассматривается как равноправный с человеком элемент более крупной электронно-семантической системы. Подразумевается, что устройство – это агент в процессе взаимодействия с ним человека. От акторно-сетевой теории, тем не менее, точка зрения этой статьи отличается тем, что эта теория уравнивает всех агентов в рамках более общей абстрактной системы, которую можно свободно конфигурировать и накладывать на разные явления. Мы же обращаемся к явлению вне всяких более широких систем, ограничиваясь универсальной ситуацией взаимодействия человека с устройством, чтобы понять специфику устройства. То есть грамматика взаимодействия рассматривается не через универсальную объяснительную систему, а как уникальная грамматика. Далее я пойду по следующей схеме. Я кратко опишу теоретические предпосылки исследования, потом добавлю к ним несколько тезисов Вольфганга Эрнста и при помощи полученной модели проанализирую случаи интересного эффекта, который происходит с фотографиями, которые сохранены в формате шпек. Основная идея, которая лежит в основе дальнейшего повествования, заключается в том, что все символические системы, появляющиеся на экране образы и электротехнические схемы, непосредственно производимые или участвующие в проектировании цифрового медиума, это способ реконструкции материальности субстрата для человека. Иными словами, это способ представления того, что на данный момент происходит, или проектирование того, что должно однажды произойти с электронной начинкой устройства, которая не видна пользователю, поскольку скрыта внутри корпуса. Такие системы принято делить на уровни. Низкоуровневое описание более подробно и, как считается, менее понятно описывает происходящее. Более высокоуровневые описания разрабатываются в первую очередь для удобства человека. Они должны быть как можно ближе к естественному языку, а синтаксис и принципы программирования должны быть интуитивно понятны. Чтобы вообразить себе иерархию языков, можно начать с двоичного кода и электротехнической схемы, как наиболее близких к цифровой основе описаний. Затем идет переключательная алгебра, которая дает возможность составлять схемы. Следующим после схем уровнем можно считать ассемблер, язык программирования, непосредственно описывающий передачу сигналов из одного источника в другой. Выражение на языке ассемблера можно перевести в выражение на языке более высокого уровня, как C++, Fortran, Java, Python и так далее. Основное условие для перевода – это наличие правил перевода и протоколов, которые можно понять как описание функции, переводящие элементы одного множества в другое. Ну, каноническое описание всего этого процесса дает машина Тьюринга, ну и различные теории и тесты, которые с ней смежны. Обязательным условием будет изоморфизм двух множеств или двух различных описаний одной процедуры или одного цифрового объекта по некоторым выделенным признакам. Изображение можно поставить в один ряд с выражениями на разных языках, которые его описывают, с кодом этого изображения, с формулой, с потенциальной схемой аппарата, создающего изображение. Если оно изоморфно всем этим выражениям, то точно так же на каком-то уровне описывает происходящее в субстрате. Вот эти взаимоотношения возможных описаний, они также лежат в основе вот общей абстрактной теории, которая связана с машинами Тьюринга. То есть это какое-то такое общее место для теории конечного автомата вычислительного вообще. Просто я добавляю сюда еще и изображения и какие-то символические вещи, как, например, иконки, тоже как бы добавляю вот к этим всем системам. Культурный или социальный смысл, которым пользователь может произвольно наделить картинку, которую видит на экране, будет вторичен по отношению к семантике, определенной синтаксическими и структурными свойствами тех языковых систем, которым она может быть поставлена в соответствии на основании изоморфизма. Поэтому не обязательно рассматривать элементы визуального интерфейса как отдельный визуальный язык. Они могут поддаваться или не поддаваться привычному лингвистическому толкованию. Ряд изоморфных выражений вместе с изображением здесь будет называться цифровым объектом. Отображающая функция, которая будет ставить их в соответствие друг другу, будет также тем, что определяет единство цифрового объекта вне зависимости от того, какое в данный момент используется описание. Следующий шаг – это добавить к сформированному выше представлению о цифровом устройстве тезис о том, что электронные медиа основаны на обработке времени и за счет этого способны формировать человеческое настоящее, которое выдвигает Эрнст. Эрнст – это теоретик из области археологии медиа. Незаметные глазу крошечные темпоральные события, происходящие внутри устройства, как он пишет, определяют сознательное восприятие пользователя как Petitus Perceptions, не знаю, как это читается, у Лейбница. Устройство делает этот микромир темпоральных событий доступным сознанию. Изображения же для Эрнста в прямом смысле состоят из времени. В данном случае то, что устройство оперирует временем, это не метафора. Эрнст использует данные цифровой электроники о синхронизации элементов платы, о тактовом сигнале и счетчиках, чтобы говорить о времени медиума, и пытается от узкого технического представления об устройстве прибора перейти к субъективному, феноменологическому, объяснить изменение субъективного темпорального восприятия через темпоральность электронной начинки устройства. Хотя Эрнст, как правило, подвергает анализу огромное количество технических подробностей, его трактовка может показаться достаточно вольной. Он выбирает такой параметр, как время, которым оперирует цифровая электроника, и делает его наиболее значимым среди других аспектов устройства прибора. Затем он пытается связать электронное время с субъективными историческими временами при помощи постструктуралистской оптики, семиотики или феноменологии. В конце концов, Эрнст утверждает глобальную независимость времени электронного медиума от большого исторического. Тем не менее, идея о том, что компьютер – это темпоральный медиум, очень важна. Эрнст подчеркивает значимость тактового сигнала и элементов синхронизации работы различных комплектующих устройства, но нет никакой нужды сосредотачиваться на этом. Показать то, что идея последовательности во времени лежит в основе идеи вычисляющей машины, можно и чисто формально. Алгоритм в целом подразумевает последовательность шагов во времени. Идея электронно-вычислительного медиума, несомненно, работает только если мыслить процессами и рекурсиями. Эрнст пишет, что логика и математика наделяют машину собственной темпоральностью, что отражено в базовых работах Тьюринга. И да, это именно так, поскольку идея последовательности во времени лежит в основании формального логико-математического аппарата, на который опирается информатика и схемотехника. Это можно доказать при помощи анализа функции штрих-Шеффера, которая в случае компьютера является своего рода универсальной логической функцией. С помощью нее можно представить любое выражение из любой интерпретационной системы. Это исключительно мой тезис, который доказывается более подробно, но сейчас нет возможности это сделать из-за длины доклада. На основании всего вышесказанного можно выдвинуть два тезиса, которые дальше предстоит подтвердить анализом случая деградации JPEG, вот этого эффекта, о котором я говорю. Первое – это что цифровая фотография формально определяется как единое целое вместе со всеми изоморфными ему описаниями. И второе – это то, что тождественность цифровой фотографии себе, что можно понять, например, как отличие оригинала от копии, имеет темпоральную природу. Анализ таких кейсов позволит, с одной стороны, лучше понять идеи Эрнста, и с другой погрузиться в те особенности функционирования цифровых устройств, которые неизбежно оказываются связаны с визуальными перцепциями. И далее я перейду к кейсу. Значит, что такое JPEG? Это способ кодирования и сжатия цифрового изображения. Он был разработан в 70-х годах, но он изменился с тех пор, но основные принципы остались такими же, и проблемы при сжатии остаются теми же, которые были. Этот формат очень удобен для пересылки, поэтому фотографии этого типа, как правило, постоянно циркулируют в сети, их скачивают, загружают, обрабатывают. Об этом писали некоторые исследователи фотографии, например, Дэвид Палмер. Интерес представляет тот факт, что JPEG всегда сжимает изображение с потерями. То есть, чем большему количеству манипуляций подвергается изображение, тем больше вероятность, что оно будет постепенно терять в качестве. И на слайде видны примеры, как это происходит. То есть, с одной стороны, там изображение в оригинальном виде, и они постепенно теряют в качестве. Сжатие означает сохранение изображения в таком виде, чтобы оно занимало как можно меньше места при минимальных возможных потерях информации. То есть изображения в формате JPEG не только постоянно включены в какие-то процессы, но и несут на себе отпечатки этих процессов. Здесь нас интересует известный эффект, который в публицистике называется деградацией JPEG. Это постепенное ухудшение качества изображения в результате многократных перезаливов на сервер и повторных скачиваний. В результате изображение может заметно визуально измениться. На нем появляются дефекты, артефакты. То же самое происходит, если вручную менять степень сжатия при сохранении. Наиболее интересный случай, когда это происходит ненамеренно, в результате циркуляции изображений в сети, поскольку тогда видимые и невидимые дефекты будут маркировать участие изображений в каких-то социокультурных процессах. И многие, кстати, цифровые художники, насколько я знаю, некоторые используют это. Вот. И было несколько акций каких-то политических, которые были связаны с использованием, эксплуатацией этого эффекта. Палмер тоже пишет об этом эффекте, но занимает несколько другую позицию. Он проводит социокультурный анализ по методологии, схожей с подходом, например, Гэллоуэя. JPEG представляет собой не качество изображения или контейнер, куда оно помещается, статичную форму, а алгоритм, процессуальную форму, название ряда процедур. На слайде представлено очень упрощенное, но достаточно репрезентативное изображение вот этого цикла. То есть вот исходное изображение, оно кодируется в файл, а потом из него как бы восстанавливается на экран обратно. А вот в квадратиках это название каких-то алгебраических процедур, которые с ним происходят в этом процессе. Упомянутые потери происходят только на определенных этапах этого процесса. Когда изображение скачивается, потери происходят на этапе квантования, а когда загружается обратно на этапе округления. Я не буду подробно останавливаться на этом процессе. При однократном прохождении цикла кодирования и декодирования изменения визуально неразличимы, если степень сжатия не скорректирована вручную до очень больших значений. Заметное влияние оказывает 70, 100, 500 перезаливов. Важно отметить здесь то, что эффект деградации высвечивает некоторые принципы того, каким образом изображение всякий раз определяется как то же самое. Артефакты или дефекты, которых со временем становится все больше, позволяют с большей долей уверенности, увидев то или иное изображение в сети, снова узнать его как уже виденное прежде. В результате, в случае простых цифровых копий сложно решить, являются ли они одной картинкой или разными картинками, потому что различные их описания могут быть одинаковыми. Но если изображение приобрело дефекты в результате многократных перезаливов, то оно будет отличаться от других копий и визуально, и в виде кода, и в более низкоуровневых вариантах описания. Иными словами, изображение приобретает индивидуальность за счет того, что циркулирует в сети и участвует в коммуникационных практиках. Это можно представить и следующим образом. Изображение остается тождественным в себе поскольку практики обмена изображениями, скачивания и загрузок формируют его историю. И эта история отражена в уникальных характеристиках кода, который будет отличаться от кода предыдущих копий изображения. И в первоначальном варианте названия это было отражено как старение, то есть я предложила такую метафору старения цифрового изображения. Тождественность изображения себе же в другие периоды времени будет поддерживаться его участием в процессах, в которых на него оказывается воздействие пользователя. Оно актуализируется, будучи включенным в такой процесс, где присутствуют акты семантической интерпретации человеком, и так реконструирует свою материальность. Способ, каким изображение приобретает свою единичность, таким образом значительно отличается от того, каким образом мы различаем изображение на других носителях. Например, картина на холсте, по моему предположению, остается всегда тождественной себе за счет однозначности материального воплощения. Материальность цифрового изображения восстановлена как описание, соотнесенное с состоянием электронной начинки устройства. Условия различения цифрового изображения как одного и того же должны быть созданы в результате его темпорального развития и участия в процессах, где присутствует человек. Есть и еще одно важное следствие из технической литературы. Описание процессов потери качества изображения в технической литературе и публицистике технической направленности должны выглядеть как описание последовательных линейных алгоритмов. Если же рассматривать эти тексты с точки зрения того, как на практике происходит то, что называется кодированием и декодированием, то оказывается, что текст такого типа не последователен, а эклектичен. Они сочетают в себе описание математических методов кодирования, части алгоритмов, уравнения и указания на перцепции, либо действия пользователя в момент, когда кодирование совершается. В результате, например, появление нового измененного кода после декодирования выглядит предшествующим появлению изображения на экране, но на практике семантика кода не встраивается в линейную последовательность с действием по перезаливу изображений или визуальной перцепции. Код возникает на экране только тогда, когда человек его запрашивает, как альтернативное описание ситуации в субстрате. Его функция – дать альтернативное описание, а не каким-то образом сопровождать материальный процесс. То, что мы находим в технической литературе, это неизбежное изменение порядка событий, которого требует интерпретация такого характера. Чтобы описать процесс деградации шпек, нужно создать структуру однозначно асинхронных событий. Здесь можно вспомнить тезис о том, что всякое описание работы устройства будет базироваться на идее последовательности во времени. Как видно из предыдущего примера, последовательность не обязательно относится к каким-то потенциально переживаемым темпоральным промежуткам. То есть это скорее абстрактная, формализованная идея неодновременности процедур, которая необходима, чтобы достичь понятности описания. Эрнст пишет о том, что вычисляемое время определяет нарративное время, и речь здесь идет о подобном эффекте. Изоморфизм возможных описаний изображения – это основное условие, при котором, вне зависимости от любых темпоральных преобразований, оно будет сохранять тождественность себе. В этом случае остается уверенность, что речь идет о том же самом изображении, что код соответствует визуальному впечатлению, и любое техническое описание, полученное отсюда, будет относиться именно к нему. То есть, действительно, можно сказать, что цифровое изображение формально является целым с разнообразными вариантами его описания. Функция, сохраняющая его тождественность себе, это функция, сохраняющая соответствие всех видов описаний на протяжении времени. Она проявляет себя, когда изображение проходит цикл кодирования и декодирования, делая индивидуальность изображения однозначной. Таким образом, кейс деградации шпек позволяет раскрыть идею Эрнста и прояснить некоторые тезисы с предыдущих слайдов. Спасибо за внимание. Я надеюсь, что-нибудь было понятно.
Okay, great. Thank you, Elena. And so this paper fits so well into this panel because it's looking at how a digital image accumulates the mark of age only when it's, if I understand it correctly, only when it's being manipulated with. So about the identity of how digital photography is constructed and what the temporal component adds to it. We have time for just one or two kind of clarification questions, I guess, before then we'll move on to our next speaker, and then we'll have questions for general discussion. And I see there is a question from Friedrich.
Okay, the host would like me to unmute. I'm more than happy to do that. Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering one thing. Does this digital aging happen when I simply open the file, or because I was just wondering, I'm opening and closing files on my computer, and some of them I've been opening and closing for at least 100 times, digital image files, JPEGs, and I couldn't see any signs of aging there. And so I was just wondering whether this kind of process of copying induces the aging, or the simple act of using them, of opening and closing them.
No, this is the main interest in this case, that it happens only when you send it usually to someone, or you upload it to some website or something like this.
Okay. Okay. So because of what I was the question I was wondering about is that I think that it's something we could also see in analog photography, where if you would have an image and you would rephotograph it, you also have all this noise entering the photograph, and the image has less of contrast, for instance, if you reproduce it the same way it was taken before and stuff like that. But I'm not going into that. I see that Peter had a question too, and I'm stepping back with blabbing.
I think we have time for one quick question. Was this from Peter?
Yes.
Oh, no, perfect, super. I just would like to know whether you had a look at JPEG 2000 as an image format, and whether you saw their problematic aspects with transcoding, recoding, and how it ages in comparison to JPEG.
Yes, but JPEG 2000 had the same problems, no? Or maybe I don't know something, but as I read, the 2000s standard has the same problems with degradation.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Elena. Please join me in thanking Elena for her paper. And next, we move on to our next speaker, who is Kate. Do you prefer going by Kate or Katie? Kate?
Either one is fine. It always gets confusing.
Okay, Kate Addleman-Frankel is the Gary and Ellen Davis Curator of Photography at the Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. I think that's the first curator, is that right? The first curator of photography at the museum. She defended her PhD at the University of Toronto, where she also taught courses on the history and theory of photography. She has previously worked as a photography curator in the Department of Photographs at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and in the Department of Photographs at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And it seems that she has a new book, perhaps based on her dissertation, or no? In the
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay, it's on the web as a teaser that we can all look forward to on the photographer Eduard Balthus on his first photogravures, posing the question of is photogravure a reproductive technique for him, or is it a photographic technique with entirely its own aesthetic? So we are very happy that you can join us, and please join me in welcoming Kate and her paper on histories of early photogravure.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thanks to the organizers for having me. I wish we could have all been together in person, but I'm glad to be here with you today in this way all the same. I'm going to try sharing just a portion of my screen so that I can see my notes as well. If I move this over here, does that work? I don't hear anyone saying no, so I'm just going to assume yes.
Yes, it works perfect.
Okay, good. All right. I should also just clarify that I wasn't quite a curator at the Musée d'Orsay or at the NGA, but I did work in those curatorial departments as curatorial assistant and intern before taking my present position. All right. So we're going to go back to the 19th century now. And in keeping with the theme of this conference, this paper will address two critical moments of becoming in the history of photography. The first is technological, the turn in the 19th century toward photomechanical processes as key to photography's future. And the second is historiographical, the field of photohistory's turn away from these same processes as a central feature of the medium's past. Photomechanical techniques produce ink-based prints from photographic negatives by combining processes of photography with those of printmaking. From the 1850s through the 1870s, the refinement of such techniques was a chief concern of the photographic establishment in France, which was still one of the most dynamic and influential sites of photographic activity in the world. Photomechanical prints were shown at every exhibition of the Société Française de Photographie from 1855 to 1876. In 1869, they made up the majority of the works exhibited. French photography and science journals followed developments in photomechanical technologies closely. Critics received new attempts at photomechanical printmaking warmly and pronounced new techniques consummate even as they were evolving. Photographers and printmakers of note staked their careers on these processes. Yet photomechanical prints from this formative period are not well represented in modern histories of photography, if they are represented at all. Outside of texts focusing on the development of photographic technologies, they tend to be accorded little importance. They are rarely discussed or illustrated in the field's abundant survey texts, and their material and conceptual complexity and relevance within the 19th century histories of both photography and fine art go essentially undescribed. I'll begin today by providing an overview of the work of one photographer who produced a particularly notable body of work in the photomechanical process of photogravure, Edward Baldus, on whom I have also, of course, written quite a lot, including a large section of my dissertation. And we see one example of Baldus' photogravure on the screen here, which was published in Blanquer-Refra's 1869 History of Photography. Baldus, who enjoyed a towering reputation amongst his peers and who figures prominently within the narrative of 19th century photography that dominates in the present day, worked only and productively in photogravure from the mid-1860s until the mid-1880s, publishing his last works just 5 years before his death in 1889. Just a note that photogravure is an intaglio process like engraving or etching. With intaglio processes, the image is incised below the surface of the plate. With planographic and relief printmaking methods, which were also partnered with photography, the image is either flush with the surface of the plate or raised above it. Baldus ultimately published more than 1,000 individual images in the photogravure process. Many of them were boldly distinct in appearance, like this one, blending photography and engraving to unusual effect. None of his contemporaries worked in this process to a comparable degree, whether in terms of sheer volume, conceptual and visual daring, or level of engagement. Baldus made his own plates from his own negatives using his own process. And beginning in 1870, he acted as his own printer as well. Yet his prints in this process are little known. Given his famous name especially, this makes him a particularly striking example of the discrepancy between the importance accorded to 19th century photomechanical prints in his time and in ours. Baldus's vast and varied photogravure corpus suggests three specific primary ways that the technique was used from the time of its early development through the initial phase of its industrialization. I'll briefly go over these three specific ways that I found to start to give an idea of what early photogravure was and what its products looked like. And then drawing from influential histories of photography published from the 1920s on, I will make some propositions about why Baldus's ink-based photogravure prints are overshadowed in the modern discourse on him by his earlier silver-based saltpaper and albumen prints. So Baldus released his first compendium of photogravure prints in 1866. And you're seeing on the left here the cover page from that volume, and on the right one of the images that was contained within. So the publication of this compendium was an event without technological precedent. was described by Ernest Lecan as, quote, a true monument of art. It comprised rare ornamental designs by famous artists of the 15th to 18th centuries, including Albrecht Dürer, Du Cerceau, Lucas van Leyden, and others, designs that Balduce had replicated with astonishing accuracy. These represent the first category of production that we see in Balduce's photomechanical oeuvre, facsimile reproductions of line engravings. This was an important and intriguing use of the photogravure process. These technically advanced copies were a high-profile and wonderfully effective means of preserving and popularizing icons of cultural heritage, particularly historic engravings whose artistic idioms and designs the powerful Académie des Beaux-Arts considered key to the French artistic tradition. These facsimiles spread through French schools and amongst artists and art historians. One printmaker, Charles Durand, whose work you see here on the screen, based his entire decades-long career on producing photogravure facsimiles. On viewing such prints, critics observed that they reproduced their models so exactly that it could be difficult to distinguish the original from the reproduction. As an intaglio printmaking method itself, photogravure reproduced not just the content of the object, that is the image, but the total object, the paper, the plate marks, the ink, and all. Indeed, Armand Durand was obliged to stamp the verso of each of his prints with a small red monogram to quiet some collectors' fears of a market laden with counterfeits. The second category of production, very different, observed in Balduce's photogravure oeuvre, is creative translations of silver-based photographs, which Balduce began producing in 1869 with his first volume on the architectural ornamentation of the Louvre and Tuileries palaces. And on the right, you're seeing one of the prints from that volume. So these prints are, quote, reproductions in the sense of the word as used by historians and historical critics of engraving. They do not replicate, but interpret. And I think that this example here shows that pretty clearly. It's kind of an extreme example of interpretation. So on the left, you have a photograph that Balduce made during his commission to photograph the decorative program of the new Louvre as it was being built. So you can see that this door frame is sitting on the construction site. It's being propped up by these bricks. It's just a fragment of something that's going on the building. And then when Balduce returned to this image to publish it in his later volume, he made a lot of changes to decontextualize it completely to make it appear as though this is an example of French classical tradition. He's gotten rid of the date, so it appears like a timeless object. And he's of course blacked out all of the background so that there's no idea anymore that this is an object that was sitting on a construction site. In the literature on photomechanical techniques like photogravure, it is taken for granted that photogravure reproductions are replications rather than interpretations or translations. That the point was to make as exact a replica of a photograph as possible in this other, more stable, more easily publishable medium. However, many photogravure printmakers were interested in the creative possibilities of their craft, and many were also familiar with the practices of traditional etching. This interest and familiarity are expressed in their work. A number of the prominent photogravure prints and projects of the 1850s and 1860s demonstrate the opportunities for artistry that intaglio printmaking presents, and suggest that the aesthetics particular to this new hybrid graphic form were eagerly observed. So I'm just going to show a couple more examples here by different photogravure printmakers. This one is by Charles Nègre, of course, another huge name in 19th century photography. Here he's not reproducing his own photograph, but a photograph by a photographer named Louis Bean, who made the photograph on the left in the late 1850s, early 1860s. Nègre was commissioned to make photogravure versions of the photographs for a publication that was published in 1874 called Voyage à la mer morte. And I don't know if you can see on your screen, the changes aren't so extreme as the ones that we just saw in the Balduce comparison, but he did add clouds here in the background. He added in some cacti here in the foreground. He increased the definition of the foliage all through the middle ground here. He increased the definition of this tree. So on the whole, he's really improving the image. He's taking it upon himself not to replicate it exactly, but to actually make what he considered improvements. And here we see a similar kind of example. The photograph on the left is by the Bisson-Frères, and on the right is by the husband and wife photo engraving team of Adolphe and Pauline Riffaut. And on the left here, you can see the skies, of course, are blown out. The shadows are not very clear. There's a certain amount of loss of detail. And of course, there are no people in the picture. And on the right, the Riffauts have, again, taken it upon themselves to make the picture kind of more appealing in the traditional sense. And they've even added some figures in at the bottom there, both to give the picture more interest and to perhaps show this pavilion at the Louvre in the way it may actually have appeared to them, you know, with some human activity. The last clear category of production that I'll talk about that's visible in Balduce's oeuvre is original photogravure images. So these are images that, unlike the facsimiles or translations that I've already discussed, never circulated or were published in any form other than photogravure. These prints were the first and only finished product to issue from the photographic negative used to create them. Tellingly, the photographic positives that precipitated Balduce's original photogravure prints are not presently known. They were created only as part of the photogravure process, of little value to their creator and no value at all to their publishers on their own, and it is unlikely that they will ever surface. The general literature on photography's history consistently points to Peter Henry Emerson and Alfred Stieglitz as the first photographers of note to explore and appreciate the aesthetic qualities and artistic potentialities of photogravure, and to Carl Klick as the inventor in 1879 of the particular photogravure process that suited such explorations. This narrative is perpetuated at the expense of, among others, the more than 250 original photogravure prints that Balduce created between 1874 and 1884. And the two that you're seeing on the screen are both from his monograph on the Palace of Versailles, published between 1855 and 1875. A lot of them have these incredible, rich, dark, black backgrounds that photogravure allowed for. And again, oftentimes this complete decontextualization of the subjects to a really kind of shocking degree sometimes. Here's one where he does include more contextual information, also from the Versailles volume and interior view. This is from his last compendium of photogravure prints, another monograph on the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. You can see at the bottom here some construction debris. He photographed it when it was still under construction, and in this case didn't take it upon himself to completely remove any evidence of that. And here's another example from the same book. And I always find this black, pitch black square at the center here really intriguing. So these prints constitute an all but unexplored original body of work by one of the 19th century's great photographers that is important within the arc of his own career by the care and attention he gave to it at significant personal economic risk, it must be said, and significant within the larger history of photography by the later artistic experiments that it predicts, meaning those of the pictorialists. That Balduce made photogravures is not unknown. Malcolm Daniel, Barry Bergdahl, and Maya Sutnick studied and provided crucial information about some of them in the 1990s, and Jennifer Yates analyzed their technical aspects in her master's thesis for Ryerson University in 2010. But the only in-depth historical investigations of these prints have been my own. And if Balduce's photogravures have gone largely unobserved, those of his contemporaries, practitioners without famous names, such as the Riffauts and Emile Durand, are invisible in the field. It is, of course, well known that photomechanical technologies were of paramount importance to the photography world of the 19th century. Photomechanical prints were more robust than photochemical ones and easier and cheaper to print and publish. The resultant flurry of activity around and commitment of resources to the photomechanical project is recorded in the texts of our field and reported in its most visible survey histories. Yet the prints themselves have been suppressed. Almost nothing about them has achieved the status of general knowledge in the field. How can we account for their present-day obscurity, this turn away from this advanced and seemingly necessary variety of photographic print? A survey of the modern literature on photography does provide some answers, as I'll aim to show now. So the pictorialists may have been the first to posit in writing that the photogravure technique, of which they were very fond, was a technique of reproduction. According to them, the photogravures that appeared in pictorialist journals like Camera Work were reproductions of their original photochemical prints. Previously, in the 19th century, all photographs had been theorized as reproductions. They reproduced their subjects, whether that was artworks, architectural monuments, or nature, that is, anything in the natural world. But for photography to be a fine art, there needed to be originals, works that could be seen, in the words of Christopher Phillips, as, quote, issuing most immediately from some demiurgic force of the artist. By employing the new phrase photomechanical reproduction, the pictorialists created a category of photographic originals. Of course, we have to go back to MoMA. So this is taken up by Beaumont Newhall. You see the man there on the right. MoMA's first curator of photography and photography's first art museum curator, period. Oh, and by the way, on the left, that's just a picture for fun of MoMA in 1936. Like the pictorialist agitators whose texts he read for guidance, Newhall's project was to secure a place for photography within the art museum and academic art history of his time. No easy feat, and one that would certainly also require original objects. It is in Newhall's The History of Photography from 1839 to the present day, which might still be considered the field's most influential text, that the phrase photomechanical reproduction appears in a history of photography for the first time. The phrase is so common today as to have engendered a belief that what photomechanical techniques produce are reproductions, and that what they reproduce are originals, photochemical prints. Newhall was succeeded at MoMA by the modernist formalist curators John Sarkowski and Peter Galassi. In their curatorial department, the idea of the original photograph was important, but the idea of the technically pure photograph was paramount. Sarkowski's special interest was in photography's exceptionality, or what made it different from all other graphic processes. In his view, this was its relationship to reality. This relationship was compromised when a print was not technically pure. This had the effect of further marginalizing photomechanical prints. As products of hybrid photographic and traditional printmaking techniques, photomechanical prints were certainly not pure. While many aspects of the way that the history of photography was initially packaged and disseminated at MoMA have been the subject of critique, the way that these first curators framed early photomechanical printmaking has never been challenged and its consequences never explored. There was one type of photomechanical print that these curators paid attention to, however, the halftone. The halftone process essentially enabled modern photojournalism and the modern illustrated press, and because of that, they're often paired. So when you read about the photo illustrated press, you're often, almost always, also reading about the halftone for a good reason. And I thought this was pretty striking. This is from a 1973 exhibition that Sarkowski did at MoMA. This is the exhibition catalog. It was called From the Picture Press. And here on the inside cover of the exhibition catalog, you're actually seeing an image that shows you the halftone screen. So they're not trying to hide the reproductive process at all. They're actually elevating it. They're letting you know that the halftone is a super important part of the history of the photo illustrated press. This is really unusual that that a photomechanical process would get this much attention. Not unusual with a halftone, but unusual with everything else. The importance of photojournalism within the field, not only of photo history, but of broader disciplines like visual media and communication studies, has led to the positioning of the halftone process as the culmination of 4 decades worth of photomechanical printmaking. Considered as such, the quote, halftone revolution sweeps aside preceding ink-based prints as primitive versions of the perfected product. A teleological view of the history of the graphic arts, the notion borrowed by historians from Victor Hugo that ceci tuera cela, or this will kill that, has been one more aggravating factor in photomechanical print's fall from view. Finally, for today, it is instructive to go back a little further and from the United States to France. In 1925, Georges Potonnier wrote his Histoire de la découverte de la photographie. It was one of the earliest widely read volumes of photography ever published, and served as another key source for Newhall when he was working on the first iteration of his history of photography. Potonnier's concern was to show that Nicéphore Niepce, a Frenchman, this was key, had invented an entirely new art form, a quote, upset, which shook, as he put it, extremely ancient customs and processes. As Potonnier knew, Niepce had also invented photogravure, and here you're seeing one of Niepce's early photogravure plates. This is actually the earliest known photogravure plate in existence held by the V&A. So Niepce had also invented photogravure. Of course, he had actually invented it first, making it the first photomechanical and photochemical process. But because photogravure was akin to earlier processes of printmaking, it was decidedly less interesting to Potonnier. He considered it to be quite like the reproductive graphic art forms already in use. Niepce thus became an engraver, he concludes in his discussion of Niepce's photogravure version of Isaac Briot's famous engraving, Le Cardinal d'Amboise, which you see here. In other words, the inventor's successful development and implementation of a photogravure process admitted him into the well-populated ranks of 19th century engravers. His invention of photography, on the other hand, and his creation of photographs made him in the 1820s an artist like no other, and one who had furthermore brought to art to its most refined point, even its apotheosis. This is what Pétonnier wished to prove and to promote in the centenary celebrations of the invention of photography in 1925. Pétonnier therefore set up a divide between photogravure and photography proper. And this formulation has essentially been repeated in every history since. A result of all of this is that early photomechanical prints have been chronically understudied. Photogravure, which I have focused on here, is only one form among many. It must be said in closing that scholars of photo history have completed major cultural and art historical studies of pre-halftone photomechanical printmaking since the 1980s. That is, since the initial period of the field of photo history's formation. Important names I would cite here are Sylvie Aubenas and Malcolm Daniel, and more recently, Jacob Lewis and Laurelie Meisel. However, the discoveries and conclusions of these authors on this topic have infrequently attained the status of general disciplinary knowledge. The potential exists. It seems a field increasingly concerned, as ours is, with the dissemination of photographic images and materiality must eventually embrace photomechanical prints as part of the story. But when this type of object does become the subject of more sustained analysis, will discussions continue to concentrate on technique and be structured around ideas of technical progress, or will there be room for the prints themselves, for the printmakers, publishers, audiences, and aesthetics? Thank you. I will stop there.
Thank you, Kate. And a healthy reminder to be skeptical of the histories that we inherit. And so we have time for just maybe any points of just clarification, and then we'll save general discussion for the end. I see those are clapping hands. Okay. Does anybody have a question, point of clarification? I see Brian Hatton may have a question.
Okay.
No.
Again, I've tried to type this into the chat, but it just doesn't appear. So I've got to ask it by gesture. It's very simple. Has anybody produced a general history of reprography as distinct from photography? Clearly what Katie has just been describing is a kind of hybrid of the two, but the phenomenon, the idea of reprography, seems to demand a kind of general overview.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with you. I don't think that there really is such a thing. I think the closest that you get are compendiums of techniques. So out of lists of different photomechanical techniques and their explanations and the ways and the times they were used. Joseph Maria Eder, for instance, even though he's of course not only interested in photomechanical technologies, but something like that is super important and has been used a lot. And there are a couple of other close examples like that, but a kind of narrative about it, uses in cultural contexts and so on, I have never seen.
Okay, thank you. Friedrich?
Unmute myself. Well, I wouldn't know about that. I wouldn't know such a history either. I think it has much to do with that the whole history of reproductive printing is just so absolutely rich in technologies. You have like literally hundreds of different processes being used and I think or being developed between 1860 and 1900 before they all mainly succumbed to something like halftone printing. But what I just wanted to ask basically or to wonder about is that what I found interesting about the reproductions about the images you showed from Barthes was that the last prints you showed, while the first prints were really had this pitch black on rather white paper, in the end he seems to go rather into some kind of brownish things and whatever. And I was wondering what he basically does in my eyes, or what I saw there, was that he was reverting his own process in the ink he used to the aesthetics of the old Addleman prints, while at the same time, while the black and white printing would start to be the medium of mass reproduction being used in the early illustrated papers and so on. Because one of the funny things is that black and white photography only came into being, so to say, at around 1890 or 1890 or 1900, because before it was always those brownish things. And I was just wondering whether you had any idea whether this kind of shifting from those very, very black inks to the rather brownish inks used towards the end, whether this is actually one of those turning points where photogravure tries to become, how to say, less reprographic and more photographic in the sense of somebody like, say, Newhall.
Right, that's a really interesting question. I think that the prints definitely become more naturalistic as time goes on. He seems a little bit less concerned in the last volume with the extreme kind of retouching, like really extreme retouching that you see in some of the earlier volumes. But in terms of, and the question of tone is really interesting. I think one of the things that appealed to him about the photogravure process was that it was so consistent. Not only did the prints not fade, of course, but there was also just an incredible consistency of production that you could, consistency of final effect that you could achieve, that you couldn't achieve with silver-based photography. And Balduce was a consummate professional, right? He wanted everything to look super slick and the same. However, the difference between the blacker tones and the brown tones, I think, is really just a problem of reproduction with the digital imagery. And on my own screen, I think that in reality, the prints are actually all quite black and white. You don't really see that shift to brown. I think that's just a problem of the tonality.
Because I noticed that at other places as well, if you go into illustrated magazines around 1900, you would find that they would revert to brownish inks.
Yes,
yeah?
that is true. Yeah,
and
that
those
is
brownish
true.
inks are rather going back to the brownish tones of Addleman prints.
Right.
And because because there is no, why would they use brownish tints? Why would they use brownish inks? And so it's rather going into this kind of pseudo, or going back to this kind of originality and direct print from the negative and stuff like that.
Yeah, anyway, I think that's true. Yeah, I think you see it in the work of the early pictorialist photographers that they're they're mimicking that. Yeah, no, that's true. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frederick. Thanks, Katie. Please join me in thanking Katie Addleman-Frankel for this really generative paper. And we'll have time for questions later as well. And now we have our final speaker for this panel. And it is a great pleasure to welcome Nadezhda Stanulevich is a photo historian who currently works at the Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography, the Kunstkamera. Her PhD thesis was dedicated to the study of Sergei Prukhetkin-Gorsky and his contribution to the development of color photography. Her academic interests are art history of photographic techniques and museum collections. She also has a fantastic chapter on the photographs of the Alhambra at the Russian Academy of Fine Arts Museum, where a section on photography was authorized in 1947, and that appears in a book titled The Power of Symbols, edited by Francine Gies and Ariane Varela Braga. Her paper today is titled Timeline Correction, Economic and Creative Aspects of the Revival of Photographic Printing Processes. Welcome, Nadezhda.
Okay, thank you. I want to close the window. Just a second. Okay, here it is a big chance for me to explain what about my everyday research with photography collection. And here it is my presentation. Okay. I hope everything okay?
Yes.
So today's paper is the chance to show my written work with the different photography collection. Sometimes there are the search of historical details, dating of photographed, and of course the identification of photographic process at the different photography. A photography was developed for fixing the time, but we knew the situation when the time on photography will be changed. Process identification is the first step in understanding and informing the preservation, access, and the use of the photography collection. In the view of the Image Permanence Institute, process identification consists of various activities like the studying of photography, component materials, its structure, aesthetics, and historical culture uses. Each photograph process has a unique fingerprint which consists of the image color, tone, the surface characteristics like shine and texture, the image structure, and light structure. At the websites graphicatlas.org by the Image Permanence Institute, all of us can search the information about the photography's details, its structure through the different types of the light, direct or raking, ultraviolet at the spatial situation, image grain with the using, for example, pocket microscope. One of the primary information for identification is the object view. Sometimes we lost the information about the time of a photo shooting, we have no information about the photographer or so on. Identification of photographic processes help us to understanding the significance of our image as an art or documentary. Image formation and image material combine into the image color. Monochrome photos from the 19th century come in various shades of brown or orange, for example. Based on common use time of each photographic processes, we can recognize about the photographic time. Some of the tables and schemas of the layer structure contains on this illustrated guide. The first paper-based photography, the salted paper processes was developed by Fox Talbot around 1835. Salted paper is a printing out processes based on the light sensitivity of the silver chloride, which is hand applied directly onto a paper support. It may to say that these photos had one layer structure. The texture of the paper fibers is visible with the naked eye. One of the type of the two-layer structure is the albumin print, that based on the light sensitivity of the silver chloride, which is suspended into albumin binder on the tan paper support. This process was introduced in 1850s by Louis Désiré Blanquer-Vrau as an improvement to the salted paper. We look on raking like the fibers with the naked eye and more so under magnification. But the photographers and their customers wanted more colors and realistic images without paper fibers. It's possible with the introduce of Barita paper paper with the special layer that wide and hard structure. For this time, all new types of the processes had three layers: paper as support, Barita layer, and the layer with the silver suspended into collodion or gelatin. Each of these technologies required extra time for the habit of photographers and photo studios that depend on loyalty of their customers. As you can see on this timeline of common use of processes sometimes cross like this. The time for the habit blurred of the time boundaries in the determining the period of the use of a particular technology. At the same time, photographers, printers, or sometimes collectors often resort to the use of already obsolete technology processes. Their motives can be different, and the most frequent we call the desire to correspond to their aesthetic movement or satisfy the needs of the customer. The inaccessibility of the modern technological devices and materials is the regional stories, for example, and the creation of fakes and crafted to deceive. At the first example, you can see this portrait, the Russian painter Nikolai Samokhish. I researched these photographs like 8 years ago, and the first time I saw this is the one layer structure print, but as I know the date of the birth and the date of the Samokhish, it's not possible the simple salted paper print. Later, then I tried to research the theme of the one-layer structure printing like a platina-type or cardboard printing. I understanding that the photographer at this situation used some art printing processes. For example, it may be a carbon. The later examples in my situation, when I saw something like a one structure printing at the Russian collection at the marriage portrait of the traveler Petr Kozlov with his second wife Elizabeth. They have a marriage photo session and photo studio both on an Aguilera in St. Petersburg in 1920s, and the photographer used the platina type or platinum prints in this sentence, and we can see the art processes in the simple photograph museum collection. And sometimes the curator in Russian had a mistake to choose the salted paper when they see the one layer structure paper. So salted paper or one-layer paper was a popular form of photography, even though it was used for a relatively short period between 1830s and 1855. Though there was a brief of interest in salted paper processes under the influence of pictorialism and one-layer structure print like platina type or cardboard print were completely out of commercial production by the end of the 1920s. The second example is the reason of use old processes as the inaccessibility of the modern technological devices and materials. Photographic lenses, negative plates, and photographic paper were being in short supplies in the Russian Empire because of desculption of the photographic materials supplies from the Germany and Great Britain with the outbreak of the First World War. The Russian photographers were forced to use old stocks and to come up with the methods of recreated materials at the beginning of the First World War and like in 1920s when the Soviet corporation started to produce Soviet materials and for different eyes. And commercial announcement and ads I found in photography periodical the announcement about the searching the old materials because the photographers have a problem with the Russian stocks in Moscow and St. Petersburg. In 1980s, Vyacheslav Srezhnevsky published Handmade Bromide Emulsion and Plate book, and it is the mark for us that they tried to make something and photo shooting with old recepts and old technologies. The third example, the situation when the photographers or dealers or printers made a fake. The the situation described in the different photo books is the Michel Matisse purchased supposedly vintage print by Louis Heim from the Walter Rosenblum through actions. Matisse announced doubts about the authenticity of the Heim's work in the 1999. Experts analyzed the fiber paper, examined the paper trademark, and looked for the optical brightness agents. The aqua paper with these types of the optical agents and the logo at the front page of these photographs didn't come into use until the 1950s, some 20 years after the print were purported to have been made. The investigation found that the Rosenblum printed Heinz photos from the negatives after the Heinz died. The Rosenblum explained that his vintage were the interpretation. It is not the fake, but the dealers knew about the situation that sometimes the photographers had used the old paper, or sometimes they didn't understand that they use contemporary paper, and later the analysis showed us that it is the fake. These described cases lead to the blurring of the time borders and sometimes significant jump in the timeline when undefined the moment of the making negatives or the printing photos. What's the reason about just talking so long about the photography process or so on? For example, in the Russian traditional. Unfortunately, today we have no educational program on the government area about the history of photography. Every time in Russian situation, it's our own time educational based on English, on French literature, and unfortunately, we have no the database like the image Permanent Institute presented on the official dates or masterclass in English, and sometimes my colleagues didn't have a chance to read or speak on English, and then we have a lacuna with the understanding of the different photomechanical process, photographical process, the time of the common uses, and the situation when the photographers use the old techniques, and especially the region examples that I explain in Russian at the beginning of the First World War. Well, maybe all photographers except the military photographers used the old techniques, album prints and so on, when they try to photoshoot in Russia at the period between 1914 or 1917. So the dates not fixing the photography exactly, but that it is very needless for us to understanding the volume on like our art print or especially when we saw for the photography as a document. So I think this is it, like my presentation, and it will be a very big attention for me to being here today.
Thank you, Nadezhda. Sorry, I had a little bit of a technical glitch there. So there's a lot in there, and again, we'll have time for a couple of questions before we go to the panel. I just want to underline a few of the contributions that this paper makes that struck me. One is the contribution to a badly needed history of conservation, photographic conservation, as a study of itself. And also this paper has implications for for history of photography that very often takes the date of production as commensurate with assumptions about how the photographs are used, even though we know that these periods of daguerreotype use, saltpaper paper, don't necessarily conform to how people are actually using them. So that's a real contribution. And then the history there in the last section to contributions to the history of recycling in relation to photography, which also has a lot of held special interest for me. So I am going to open it up to if anyone has any, any points of clarification or information for Nadezhda, and then we'll go to the general discussion.
There is one question at the chat. It's,
is there? Okay,
it's
thank
in
you.
Russian, so I will translate it to you.
Oh, all right, thank you.
So this is the question by Vasilisa Zukova, who's asking if Nadezhda could recommend some research on the attribution of analog vintage prints, such as prints on glass or on film. How do you define, how do you attribute the time when the image was made if the negative is on glass, for example?
Did you want to take that question?
Можно я тогда отвечу, я отвечу туда по-русски, вопрос был задан по-русски. Sorry, I'm answering in Russian because I saw this, maybe Vasilisa didn't know correct translation of my presentation. Василиса, я хотела бы отметить, что, например, на этом же сайте Института по исследованию изображений, у них точно так же есть база по негативным материалам, потому что вы спрашиваете на самом деле, судя по всему, об оригинальных материалах, то есть о негативах на стекле, на пленке. У них точно так же есть атрибуционные признаки по этим материалам, и в этом смысле исследователи не разделяют негативы или фотографии. В принципе, мы точно так же пользуемся такими же таблицами по любому типу материалов, будь они первичные или вторичные. I hope that I'm answering to this question. And it's, of course, as Jennifer said, at a special discipline, and unfortunately in Russia we have no special sources. We must read old books and of the 19th century, or translate the information into English or French.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think that it's a general need and the gap in a lot of the scholarship, the roots of supply and materials as well. And so anyone else have a if I don't see any other points of clarification in the chat. If not, we can move to, oh, I see Brian Hatton has a hand. Brian.
Quick question.
I think you unmute.
You just mentioned glass. I just wondered were the history of magic lamps in slides and transparencies in general fits with this history of paper prints. Is there, are there parallels? Are they changing at different rates, and so on? Hello?
No, it's the same situation. The date of the introduce the technology, then some time to the waiting, then photographer use them. So in the special literature, at this chapter about the negative, the print, or another technique like the transparency or so on. So it's the same situation, but they easily to show the prints, not negatives. And unfortunately, I have no chance to show you the negative collections from the Russian collections.
Okay, great, thank you. Not seeing, oh, is there another question in the chat? If not, we can move to the general.
No. It's
Maybe Daphne.
question.
No, that's just Vasilisa saying thanks for Nadezhda answering the question.
Okay, great. All right, so we can move to the general discussion now for the next half hour we have. Is that right? And you know, questions for individual the individual speakers or for the group as a whole. And what we might do, you know, 10 or 15 minutes into it, maybe just to take several questions from the audience, and then the speakers can start off with questions for individuals or for the panel, but then towards the end, maybe if there are several people who want to ask questions, we can just put them all together and then let the panelists decide which one they'd like to take, so that we get all the audience, as many audience questions as we can, and feel free to use the chat as your space as well. While you're thinking about that, while we're thinking about that, I guess I have a question for Katie, and it has to do with the historiography of photography, and you know, something I think has been noted, and you know, is the way that the art history and the art museum narratives about photography became really enshrined and came to define photography, certainly within part of the discipline of photographic history. So I was wondering if you might say a little bit more about that. You know, are there examples of scholars working on photogravure in other areas of photographic practice, such as botany, other scientific disciplines, and to what extent are those, you know, do you have an idea why those, if there was other work, which I don't know, but if there was, I mean, to what, why was, could you say a little bit more about why that was a blind spot, or why it wasn't taken on board?
Yeah, sure. I'm not actually aware of any studies in any other fields that have focused specifically on photogravure or another photomechanical process. They've really just been looked at very little across disciplines, which is interesting. And it was really interesting to try to uncover some of the reasons why that might be. But one thing that I think it's fair to say is that I think in other disciplines outside of the history of photography, precisely because of the reason that you mentioned, the development of photography within the discipline of art history, is that you see a much greater conflation between photography and photomechanical processes. Within other disciplines, there doesn't seem to be so much interest in or need to distinguish between all of these different processes. And the reason for that could be because of a lack of familiarity with technologies of photography. But it could also just be a kind of more, I don't know, kind of more open or generous view of what photography is. And because of some of the reasons that I outlined, I think there's just been such a focus on photochemical techniques within the history of photography that these photomechanical techniques have been sidelined in a way that they haven't in other disciplines.
This is really interesting. Okay, questions? Friedrich.
Yes, unmute myself. Thank you, and for taking what I've been thinking about during this panel is that what I find so funny about the whole of history of photography and theory of photography, so to say, is that the moment of exposure is basically kind of privileged, the privileged moment of what is in the focus of most research in a way, because all those other moments, the moments when the exposure finally gets into the image that we see, or when the image gets distributed to other people by way of printing, or by way of copying, or by way of whatever or by way of distributing it through newspapers or through the mail or through whatever. All those moments basically, and then get looked at. It's basically something that is not very much a subject of photo historical research at all. It's always about the moment the photograph apparently kind of came into being, as if there was a single moment of the exposure. What I liked about the 3 lectures today is that from this different perspective, this idea was challenged by the way that they all pointed from, as I said, different perspectives to that a photograph comes into being at very and changes and shifts and goes elsewhere, and at very different moments. And I think this kind of the temporality and the chameleon-like changeability of the photographic image is something that is, I think, as under-researched as, say, the photogravure and all the other photomechanical images. So it's not really a question. It's rather some kind of musing about what I learned or what became more aware to me during listening to today's lecture.
Would any of the panelists like to respond to Friedrich's reflection?
I could just say that I think that some of the most interesting work that, first of all, I think that's really a really interesting point and a really good point. And I think that some of the most interesting work in photo history that's being done right now in scholarship is precisely on that. You know, how are photographs disseminated? How are they published? How does the image change? And especially now with all of the online digital image sharing networks, and what this means about the dissemination, what this means for the dissemination of photographs. Sounds like there's been this incredible shift, and it's just happening at a far vaster scale than it ever has before. But hopefully, some more attention on that will lead to increased attention on what happened previously with all of the different channels through which photographs have always moved. Yeah, I think there is some really interesting work happening in that area, but I guess often in the area, particularly of the photo press, and maybe not as much in other areas of the history of photography.
Mm-hmm. If I could just jump in too, maybe to say that even with the histories of dissemination, a real need for histories of viewership, and reception, because even if they're out there, what do we know about what people did with them and how they respond to them, which may require new methodology or different kinds of methodologies that also look at texts, meaning making. Other panelists want to take that up while we're teeing up some questions.
Well, if I may, okay.
No, okay. Well, I see a hand from Olga.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, hello, and yeah, thank you for your papers, inspired papers. Yeah, my question is, it might be close to Jennifer's questions, and it might be to all speakers, as all of you talked about the materiality of images and the importance to consider this the materiality of images for understanding the history of photography, but primarily I thought about it when I listened to Kata's paper. So that maybe if we talk about this importance of this subject, how we can maybe, I don't know, improve the history narratives about photographs if we consider the material, that the 19th century photographs were reproduced by photomechanical processes, not primarily, but it was important. Well, how maybe the history of 19th century photographs could look like, not like at this time, but maybe it is not a chronological approach. It might be some kind of another approach. What kind of perspectives it could give, and it is well relevant for Nadezhda papers as well. So how we can, I don't know, maybe rewrite some chapters. Sorry, it's a bit naive question, but I hope that it's clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, would any of the panelists like to take that? The question about the intervention into history of photography that the papers point to. And I want to bring in Elena as well, Vivich, because I think the paper also speaks to this.
Olga, I think that it's not about the using the timelines. It's the base. Because if we use something only aesthetic, we also made a mistake. It's the situation to knowledge about these efforts, the knowledge about the details, something like maybe rewriting the tables of the timelines, like this Image Permanence Institute websites. They have a special marks and what processes your effort, what the processes like, for example, salted paper print, or one layer print slicer carbon, or the platinotype. And I think this we need a time that our community started to be the biggest, and all of us must be one based for the talking about the history of photography, based on these timelines, technology process, and after then something like aesthetic.
Okay, great. Thank you. Other questions?
Брайана включите, пожалуйста. Brian has a question.
Brian?
Last point. My own knowledge of the history of photography is entirely art historical, really. It would be interesting to have two timeline chronicles, let's say, of photography. One of the artistic peaks, let's say, and the other of the technical, commercial, social planes from which those artistic peaks rise. And what is the changing ratio of high artistic peaks and in relation to the general production and consumption of and propagation of photography?
I think you have some attempt at that, right? I mean, I feel like histories of photography are just get bigger and bigger as we learn about more and more materials and we gain more and more knowledge. I mean, I feel like it was easier toward the beginning of the 20th century to write a kind of relatively slim volume like Newhall's, because there were just still so many photographs at the time that were buried in archives that we didn't know anything about. This is a real archaeological process. And then over time, more and more materials become exposed, and suddenly historians are faced with this incredible glut of information that you need to analyze and create a narrative from, and it becomes harder and harder, and the histories get bigger and bigger. And I think if you look at a history like Friso's New History of Photography from I think the mid 90s, I mean, there's a real effort there to include like everything, with all of these experts in different areas contributing a chapter. And I think there's real value in that. There's a lot of information there, but it also, at the end of the day, I think also just serves to remind the reader that there is also a lot more out there that is not being addressed. And maybe at this point, it's just impossible to have a definitive, well, I think it is impossible to have a definitive history of photography. But then, yeah, that leads to all kinds of questions about, you know, what the field is, what the central fields of the question, what the central questions of the field are, what the central materials of the field are.
Yeah, these are good points. And even in the 19th century, the problems, you know, working on legal cases, seeing that, you know, it was a problem even at the time, that an issue at the time, that some people had expertise on certain earlier images that were still being talked about. So people are very much talking about daguerreotypes in the 1870s and 80s because they're resurfacing as part of, you know, earlier court cases. So these timelines are very crude, but maybe helpful as well. And the question of who, yes, the field. Other questions or points, especially for Elena, on the digital photography and the markers of age. I don't know, Elena, if you have.
I can comment the previous comment of Friedrich that he said that the process of degradation of JPEG is the same as when we make a photo of the photo. Am I right? You mean okay. I think that there is a small that there are more differences that we can imagine, because this is the effect is not only that the quality, there are some losses of quality, of loss of information. The main point is that there is a big semantical system in which the image is included while it loses this quality. So and this system includes a person and some technical devices which have their own semantical conditions. And the main interest is that these degradations happens by these specialities of technical, the whole technical process. I don't know if I can explain it right, but when you make a photo or the photo, you can make it for yourself, and you can have any explanation of this. You can just make it for fun, and there might be no other person involved in this. There might be even no digital device. You can use analog photo camera. Well, so I think that it is not that important that degradation happens. It is important how it happens, and I try to speculate about this in my report.
I'm absolutely with you there, and I liked it a lot. If I just may jump in, Jennifer, you just stop me when I should just keep my trap shut.
Go ahead, and then we have a question after you.
Okay, then it just briefly, what I found so intriguing also about your answer to my short question after your lecture was that I thought the image needs to be used to degrade. and it needs to not to be used just by looking at it, even though this it needs to be copied. It needs to be reproduced, so to say, and that is something which the simple looking at it apparently does not degrade the digital image. What degrades it is when I want to make somebody else see it, and that's something which some years ago I came across a stack of pornographic photographs here from Eastern Germany, and what follows me since then is that most of those photographs were photographs after photographs after photographs after photographs, and they were all quite noisy, and they were all blurry, and they had all kind of, how to say, noise in them. And what I found so interesting there was it seemed to me that this kind of random noise that entered those images is something through reproduction, by the way of reproduction, is something that apparently has a certain similarity to what happens to those JPEGs when they are copied, when they are compressed, sent around, opened, reproduced again, and compressed again. And so this kind of reproduction cascade, so to say, in both cases has a similar effect, that those images become noisy. And that was just the observation where I thought that there's a difference between looking at the image and further distributing it. And further distributing makes the noise. Looking at it also may damage the image, but on a completely other level. That was just the clear differentiation I was interested in.
This is interesting.
Okay, great. So we have a question, I think, for Katie from Surya Nandini Narain, and you can unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi, thank you for your papers from this panel. They were really rich. I have a question about the notion of value and how it's really attached to the visual media that all of you actually spoke about. So for instance, how does the photogravure get positioned in a scale of value at the time of its production, and then how is it valued now, monetarily, in the circuits of exchange, in the circuits of display? Equally so about the digital image, how is value attached to it, especially in the times of reproducibility? Does that kind of question arise at all?
I can start. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Elena.
You mean how people attribute some value to it? You mean some ethical considerations or something? You mean when they attribute to it some that importance, or and you ask how it happens, right? I understood you.
Monetary or cultural value, is that, you can, yeah.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Monetary or cultural value, yes.
Well, I think that it happens by some other laws which are more connected with social, cultural background, and it's not really connected with with technical processes. There are some researchers who think that the technical processes determine how people attribute value to those pictures, but I don't really think we can talk about this, because those technical parameters there are more practical oriented, and I think this point of view can exist, but I don't really associate I'm not sure it is right in this case.
Katie, did you want, or
sure,
respond?
Yeah, I can speak to the photogravure. Speak about that in the case of photogravure. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting to me about it is how valuable they were in the 19th century and how little value they are accorded in the 21st century and how little in the 20th century as well. In that case, there is an economic difference too between photomechanical and photochemical prints. One of the reasons why photomechanical prints were so important is because they were cheaper to produce. They could be allied with printing publishing processes that were already in place. So the idea was to, create a technology that could just be adapted to these industrial processes that already existed and to create an industrial photographic product. Of course, they really weren't industrial in the beginning phase. It took a really long time for it to get there. It was really a craft product for decades, which is something that it's not really seen that way, but it should be. And there was a ton of cultural value attached to it. I mean, if you look at France in particular, I mean, the way that critics went on about these processes, and this was really seen as the future of photography. There are some really incredible quotes from people like Lacan saying things like, photography has finally achieved its perfected form now that we have the photogravure or the photolithograph or whatever it is, like really telling statements about it. And then, yeah, one of the reasons why the topic is so interesting to me is because later on, this is completely lost. And I think you see that with all photomechanical prints, but I think it's really striking with the facsimiles of engravings, because that's something that researchers today have like so little interest in. I mean, there's really not very much interest in art reproductions in general in any form, but especially with these photogravure facsimiles. But it's the degree to which they reproduce the original is really extraordinary. I mean, and there was a real concern about counterfeit because it's pretty much the exact same materially as the object that it is reproducing. So that's something that was like a really striking achievement, that you could create these kinds of facsimiles at the time, which of course no one is creating now either. So it's also a kind of product that it just they're no longer being produced, they no longer exist. But you can find them very cheap on eBay. There's not a lot of interest.
Okay, we have a question in the chat, and I'm just going up there. Does the degradation facilitate interventions that may complicate or alter the initial image and endanger image value as a testimony? Rui, do you want to try the sound? I know you said the sound wasn't great, but we can, if you want to try it, we can, if you want to try to unmute. Otherwise, I think that's a question for Elena.
Mm-hmm. One of the ideas was that for digital images, we can't really tell if when they are not degrading, we can't really tell, is it a copy or is it an original? It is hard to tell, and I personally think that we don't have enough methods or informations, or we can't argue that those are copies or the same image. The only thing that can prove that this is the original is the name of the file. For example, we name it 1, 2, 3, 4, and we consider that this is the original image. And when we copy it and tell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we think this is the copy. But this is not so clear still. Are they copies or not? Because they appear to the screen every moment as something new, because it doesn't has any realistic material substrate that persists through time. It's just like light waves, and we can't really tell that are there originals or are they copies. But when they degrade those images, they became something that can be identified as something by another, which has another identity, because it has now some history of using and reusing, and this process like is constructing the originality of this photograph. So when we have a lot of copies, a lot of copied files, we can tell are they copies or are they original. But when we re-upload this picture and it has now artifacts or some changes in code, we can say that this is the one picture, and the less are we can't say anything about it. It was about the part of the question which is connected, where it says is it facilitating interactions that may complicate or alter the initial image? The answer is that we really can't tell where is the initial image if it is not degrading, or something else happens with it, which constructs its initiality. I don't know. And what do you mean by endanger image value as a testimony? Do you mean that someone would consider that the degraded image is less not so good, or what do you mean by it? I just don't understand.
Wait, this might come to us through the chat, the clarification on that. I think that is, I think your interpretation of it is what is meant. That's great if you want to type in the chat.
Даша, ты Руи не можешь размьютить, чтобы он...
While we wait for that, but I think this what you're pointing to, the way that the in the digital realm, that it's possible to track the use and abuse uses and reuses of photography is something that may propel new questions methodologically and historiographically for earlier histories of photography, where we do have lots of historiography about photographs and photographic prints that maybe never really were activated or never really viewed by very many people, and less on ones that were widely discussed or debated. I think I don't see if we, oh yes, okay. Rui, would you want to unmute and respond to Elena's question or elaborate on it if your sound's working on it?
Well, I just can say, if I understood this question right, that I don't consider that any technical things that construct materiality of digital image or are connected with it, or code or some other things about which I talk, they are somehow connected with the attributed value to the image, because we can attribute a value, value to it as we like any. We can make any suggestion about it. We can, for example, I can see something that reminds me of my parents' home, and I will think that this is a good image. I can do it quite freely, and I don't think that any technical parameter can be crucial here. If I said it correctly.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. So maybe with that, we're just coming up to the top of the time for our panel discussion, and so not seeing other questions. I think I will just bring our discussion to close and thank each of the panelists for very insightful discussion and presentation, crossing materiality, temporality, historiography, and really exciting new areas of research, and also to the audience for your questions and discussion and in the chat. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and then I turn things over to Frederick and Maria.